Have you gone to any of the places that you talk about?
I have been to London,
Yeah.
and that is the main feature
Right.
of these books. But there is no medieval London anymore. That London is gone.
Right.
So I rely on maps of that period to really research maps they're pretty darn accurate and give me street names and the churches and their locations and things like that. So it's very handy to be able to name the street that the characters are walking on and where his favorite tavern is or the street that he lives on.
Yeah, and there's so many layers of history in London too that you can really get a sense of what
Right.
it really feels like, which is
Right.
what's part of the wonderful stuff about what you write when you are able to.
Well, you want
put the
to
reader
immerse
into that
yourself in
position.
that time,
Yeah.
and so to have just the little details really make a big difference.
So it's like 9 months.
It's like having a baby, yes it is. And then you got to send them to college, and yeah, it's all kinds of things.
How far are you along in this new book that's coming out?
Well, The Demon's Parchment is already written, and it's pretty much getting ready to be rolled out, well, in the fall. But number 4 is already written too.
Oh, wow.
So my editor has that. I worked ahead.
How does the process work? You've gotten a contract to write all of the books? Or how
Well,
does that-
it started with beginning to write the series. And the first time that I wrote the first in the series, I wanted to see if I could write a series, because prior to that, I was writing these historical fiction novels that were all standalones. And so I didn't know if I could write a series. But so as soon as I was done with the first one, I just started writing the next. And during that process, while you're writing the next one, while you're trying to market the first one, trying to get an agent, and then the agent is trying to get an editor, and so that takes quite a long time. In reality, there was a first in the series prior to Veil of Lies, but that didn't go. That was rejected everywhere, and so that didn't become the first. The second, which is Veil of Lies, became the first, if you can figure that out. So during all that time, I just kept writing the next and the next and the next. I think from the moment Veil of Lies finally went out to the editor, and he offered me a contract for it, it was another year after we signed until the book was on the shelf. So
Wow.
it takes a year anyway. And so the publishers do like you to have a book a year. So to be able to churn at least one out in 9 months is really great. But I was ahead, so I want to sort of keep my lead if I can.
And the process of working with an editor, what is that
I
like?
love my editor at St. Martin's. We are very simpatico about this character and about the whole medieval noir sort of milieu. And basically, what he does is when he gets the manuscript, he will read it many times, and then he will make suggestions for a few changes here and there, more description, clarifying certain things. Because as the author, you're sitting in a room by yourself, just writing, just working on it. And, sometimes things get a little off in the storytelling, and you have to be brought back. Something doesn't make sense, or you started on a different tangent and you changed your mind and forgot to go back. So the editor will find those things, and we work together, and we change it to make it a better manuscript.
So do you write at home, or do you
I do.
write at
I
coffee
write it-
places? Or?
I can't do it very well in public. I kind of need to lock myself away because there's a lot of action in these books, and I like to act them out. So in doing that at Starbucks, I don't think they'd appreciate me swinging a sword.
That's pretty funny that you can't really do those things in public. That's great. That's really interesting. Eric, how about you? Like, how does the process work for you?
Pretty much the same way. I write at home
Sword
as well.
swinging?
No sword swinging.
okay.
But I don't like going out in public much in my sweatpants and a ratty T-shirt, and I can do that at home. So
Right.
That's how I write. And I'm a bit, with the books I've written so far, they've been a bit faster because they were stories that I'd already covered as a journalist, so I was pretty familiar with them. In
Now,
reality,
your first book was actually a bit about baseball.
my
is that
very
right?
first book was nonfiction.
Okay.
It was a biography of a guy who was a major league ball player who in the off season was a gangster. here in LA. He
That's
committed
great.
a murder, became famous playing ball in San Quentin and Folsom prisons in the 50s. There's a Pasadena connection for you. He, when he was in the major and minor leagues, he was at spring training a couple of times in the San Gabriel Valley and in Pasadena and around those areas.
There you go.
But that book took enormous amounts of research. That took me about 2 years to write, and I did 100 and some odd interviews for it, and traveled all around, and took forever to get permission to get into San Quentin and Folsom prisons to look around, things like that. These books have taken less research, although I like them to be very accurate in terms of the geography especially. So I go back to maps and double check my memory on things. As a matter of fact, I recently at the LA Times Book Festival had a great compliment from a guy who came up with a copy of my second book, Grave Imports, which is set in Thailand and Cambodia primarily. And he had just been on a trip to Cambodia. And he said that a couple of different days he just took the book with him and followed the footsteps of my character around
That's
Phnom
terrific.
Penh and around Siem Reap, where Angkor Wat is, and had a wonderful time doing that. And it was a great compliment. I would love it if most of my readers can do that, and I try to write so that they can. As for the stories themselves, I didn't want to research them that much in depth because I'm writing fiction. So I wanted the basic ideas and what happened in the stories and what they imply and the broader picture to be there. But I didn't want it to get bogged down in so many facts that people would read it and say, well, wait a minute, why didn't he just write a nonfiction book about this?
Right.
So consequently, I was careful not to do that much research of that nature on those books.
Now,
Future books I will.
In Jerry's case, I mean, her character, Crispin Guest, is a medieval character, lives in a different time. I would imagine is pretty dissimilar to who she is. Whereas, although it might have some of the same inclinations, I don't know.
It's all the arrogance is mine.
But in your case, there might be a few more similarities. How do you, what is it about your character that's different from you? Are there parts that are semi-autobiographical? How does that,
Well,
you talk about the stories being true. I mean,
There are parts that are quite autobiographical, and I've been to most of the places that I write about, much to the discomfort of my father at times, because some of the books deal with rather sleazy environments. And
yeah,
things.
they do.
So, yeah, there are autobiographical elements. On the other hand, it is fiction, and I'm fond of saying that in novels, every character in the book has some element of me in them. It's easier for me to write that way if I can relate to the character in some way.
Right.
In my most recent book, the fourth in the series, there's a rather abrupt change midway through the book, and the narration is taken over by an entirely different character who's completely different than I am. A woman who is Chinese descent but grew up in Mexicali, Mexico, and is now living back in Asia, and is Ray Sharp's sidekick. And she takes over the narration completely. And in reality, I had more fun writing her character than Ray Sharp's. I loved writing Ray Sharp's character, but it was beginning to be a little too easy. And with her, I had to think more to put myself in someone else's shoes and try and stretch my imagination a little more to get into those shoes.
And how did your editor respond to that?
She loved it. She thought it was great. Woman editor, Allison Jansen at Bleak House Books, and she just totally loved it. I didn't tell her I was going to do it ahead of time. I just went ahead and did it halfway through the book. And she called me up as soon as she got to that point in the book and said, "No, really? You did that?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "That's great." And then took it from there. I don't want to tell too many details because it's sort of an extreme plot twist. But
And that's in Shanghai.
Shanghai, which also is one of the books that did take a bit more research, as it's set in Hong Kong and Shanghai during the handover ceremonies in 1997 of Hong Kong going back to China. And at that time, I was in Hong Kong and very familiar with Hong Kong. But I did not go to Shanghai in 1997. I've been there a number of other times. But it's one of those places that changes so dramatically and so rapidly that I wanted to get everything right about Shanghai in that year. And I had to find people who were living there and interview them, and I had to find tour guide books and things that were written in that year, things of that nature, to get my facts right. So.
Wow. And it takes you about 9 months to a year?
No, actually, these, because I think I was familiar with the stories, went pretty quickly. About, on average, to get to a clean first draft that the editor was happy with, took me about 4 months.
Oh, that's fast.
Maybe 5.
That's fast.
Yeah.
And have you finished your 5th yet?
Not the 5th in the series. The book I just finished writing is my first non-mystery. It's not even a crime novel. It's set in Los Angeles in 1947 and is more of a coming-of-age story, largely taking place in the bars and nightclubs along Central Avenue south of downtown, which that took an awful lot of research to know what was where and what they were like and what musicians were playing in them and things of that nature. So
it's very fun, though.
Yeah.
Very, very fun stuff.